can I offer you a very warm welcome to Riddel Hall here today, and of course a very special welcome to our speaker, Andy Haldane. Andy's going to take some time this afternoon to talk us through some of the issues, the concepts, the aims, the objectives, if you will, of the UK government's levelling up strategy. And yes, it does still exist. Now, Andy is currently Chief Executive of the RSA, but previously was Chief Economist of the Bank of England. But today he's here in his governmental capacity to define and develop the government's levelling up strategy. A strategy designed to deliver opportunity across the UK and really address some of the inequalities from an economic and social perspective. Now, given the inequalities that we face here in Northern Ireland, this is a really important area for us. For me, levelling up means linking up, locally, nationally and internationally. We can't build a whole innovation system here in Northern Ireland for every sector, but we can contribute to pretty much every sector by working across the UK, across the island of Ireland, and indeed internationally. And we shouldn't forget that Northern Ireland has a unique position with dual market access that we really could capitalise on. Now, universities play a really major role in levelling up, whether it's through education and skills, and we produce many of the skilled workforce of Northern Ireland, or about research and innovation, where we drive many of the new companies in Northern Ireland. We're a very good university in terms of entrepreneurial impact. We're rated #1 in the UK, and our economic impact locally is quite significant. For each £1 million of research income, the university's research and knowledge exchange activities generates 9.8 million of economic impact. These are data just released this week by London Economics. So we make a really big contribution to this economy. Queen's generates £3 billion per annum of economic impact. That's a 45% increase in the last 5 years. And it's a benefit to cost ratio of 8:1. So Northern Ireland is a really great investment. And of course, we've got the City deal, where Queen's plays a role in the innovation pillar, and we drive many projects which can act as a catalyst to address the productivity gap in Northern Ireland. Now, looking at inequalities, we in Northern Ireland have got the lowest investment in recurrent research and innovation funding of all UK regions, whether we look at it as a gross figure or on a per capita basis. We've got the lowest drawdown from UKRI for funding, and that arguably reflects a lack of infrastructure and previous investment. We can make a difference, but we've got to invest. We're the only region in the UK which has reduced government investment in tertiary education. Now, according to our own Department for Economy's data, we've seen a 40% reduction in higher education funding between 2010-11 and today. And we face a continued threat to the budget because of a focus on cost with one-year budgetary horizons rather than a focus on investment and return on investment with a medium to long-term view. But despite that, research at all the universities in Northern Ireland is going very well. Both Ulster and Queen's performed very well in the recent Research Excellence Framework. In Queen's, we were first in the UK for agriculture and food, 8th for law, 4th for health and biomedicine. These are really good data. We've got fantastic opportunity and fantastic infrastructure. And the things that we're good at in research, both in terms of subjectivity or discipline and translation, are the things that matter for our economy. So we've got a really fantastic opportunity here in Northern Ireland to make a difference, to drive societal change, to drive the economy, and we can certainly do it not just by levelling up, but by linking up. And I'll now hand you over to Andy. Welcome to Queen's.
Well, thank you, Ian, for that lovely introduction. Afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming along. Great to see you all. It's fantastic to be here in Belfast and at Queen's in this amazing Riddel Hall. Of course, imagine every speaker that's been here tells you how lovely it is. But because I'm an economist, I'm going to tell you exactly, in numerical terms, how lovely it is in about 5 minutes' time, so just wait for that. I think some pre-reading was sent around, which was the 375-page white paper that we published. And I'm told you've all done that pre-reading, indeed committed it to memory. which is admirable. Some of that I'll be touching upon today for those that didn't get through the whole thing. In some ways, Ian has taken my punchline. Are we still doing levelling up? My verdict on that is, what it's worth is, we have to. We can't afford not to. And in actual fact, when you think about why this is worth doing, there's a bunch of reasons. Pure reasons of social justice, inequalities too large. But there's another reason, a much more obvious reason, is that it holds the key to growth, something the new government speaks about a lot. They are pro-growth, go growth. And the essence of levelling up is about unlocking the potential in people and in places that would drive that growth. Those are among the reasons, I think, why this will remain front of stage when it comes to the future agenda. And I'll say a bit today about several aspects of that. I'm going to talk a bit about why to do this. That's the easy bit. Then a bit about what it is. What is it that's being levelled up? Then the third and final element is the how, the hardest bit, which is how practically we turn the dial on that, both here in Belfast, in Northern Ireland, and indeed beyond. And hopefully that paves the way for a discussion with Emma afterwards about the specifics here. I'm keen to hear from all of you about what needs to be done to unlock that potential, because my very, very strong sense is that the potential that could be unlocked here in Belfast, in Northern Ireland, is very considerable. Here could be the poster child for why levelling up really matters, including for a national growth strategy. So let me, this is me, by the way. I've aged since then, although it was only actually 3 months ago. And here's the rough running order. Kicking off then, and I'll canter through this, because I think some of this will be familiar to many of you, with why we're doing it. Well, we're doing it because those spatial differences across the whole of the UK are both very wide and are, if anything, widening over time. Here's a picture that speaks to that. It's a map. You'll see plenty of maps today of differences in levels of pay across different parts of the UK. No need to look at that in any great detail, but the key takeaway is the differences between pay in the highest regions and in the lowest regions. That's a difference of 2, right? Lowest paid region, people are paid about half on a weekly basis what they are in the highest pay region. What is true of pay is true of productivity, is true of wealth, is true of a bunch of other financial metrics. And what's true of wealth is also true of health. This is a map of healthy life expectancy rates across different parts of the UK. Again, without going into great detail, the key takeaway is just how variegated that map is. The gap between the bottom and the top in healthy life expectancy terms is about a decade. In other words, huge. Within region, you can often find differences in healthy life expectancy that are north of a decade, which I think is, in some ways, is truly extraordinary. So it's true of wealth, it is true of health. If you look at this on a historical basis, and apologies here that Northern Ireland isn't on this picture, I couldn't get the data going back over 100 years, but this just looks at levels of, this is productivity, a measure of success across a bunch of nations and regions. The key takeaways from this picture are, one, that they haven't moved much over time. Who was top in late Victorian times remain top today. Those that were towards the bottom then remain towards the bottom now. These spatial differences have proven remarkably resilient over time. That's takeaway one. Second key takeaway is that those differences between regions and nations today are at their highest level for more than 100 years. You have to go right back to late Victorian times to spot a time when those differences between places were larger than they are now. They've been widening for at least 70 years, since at least the Second World War. And what is true historically is no less true internationally. Here's again a simple metric of spatial difference between different parts of different countries, in this case the OECD countries. The key takeaway here is that the UK, which is fourth from the left, is towards the bottom of that league table. Its spatial differences are far larger, certainly, than most other advanced economies among the OECD. Only Turkey, Colombia, and Hungary do worse than us when it comes to those differences between the best and the rest. On all of these pictures, the ones you've seen, it's fair to say Northern Ireland tends to be towards the bottom of the pack. The gaps are as large between here and London South East as anywhere else across the UK. Now, I mentioned wealth, financials, I mentioned health, but this is not a uniform pattern across all measures of success. So listed here are a number of different ways in which you might measure the success of a place. Financial things like income, educational things, health things like life expectancy. Then towards the bottom, some slightly more subjective things like how deep is your network, how satisfied are you with your lot. And these numbers, they look at the correlation between the measure at the top, regional productivity, and these other things. For mostly, those numbers are positive in green. In other words, areas of high pay are also areas of high, healthy life expectancy. But towards the bottom, those correlations are negative, which is to say, this is a varied pattern. Not all those places with high pay and high productivity have high levels of connectivity or high levels of life satisfaction. So, for example, if I were to show you a picture, as I'm now doing, of levels of happiness, this is the map of happiness, that is, to some significant degree, the mirror image of the map of pay I showed you a few minutes ago. So I live in the most miserable place in the country. And my daily commute would bear testimony to just how miserable that is. And this morning I got on a plane, crossed the Irish Sea, and came here to the happiest place in the UK, according to these metrics. I can tell you very precisely how pleased I am to be here. I am 25% pleased to be here on this measure of life satisfaction. Now, the bad news there, of course, is later on tonight, I'll get back on a plane, go back home, and my satisfaction will fall again by 25%. So a bit of a roller coaster day for me today, but for the moment, I'm over the moon to be here. And this just makes the point that money isn't everything. When it comes to all matters leveling up, some of what might seek to level up is not just pay and productivity, but also some more subjective sense of how well is your life going. People in London are miserable as sin because it's very congested and very expensive to live there. And in some ways, the perversity here is that these spatial differences aren't working for those places lagging and left behind, but nor are they working for those places that are congested and forging ahead. We can do better on both fronts to level up different dimensions. I'll come back to that in a sec. Another key point to bear in mind. I've told a story about regions. People like telling stories about, I don't know, north versus south, or cities versus towns. And the truth is, that's a real caricature, an inaccurate caricature of the nature of spatial differences across the UK and elsewhere. This picture just looks at a measure of success. This is GVA, GDP, per head pretty much. It looks at the differences within region and nation, as well as between region and nation. And the key takeaway is that the differences within region are larger than those between region. We have a hyper-locality, a granularity, a deep granularity when it comes to how well places are performing. Bigger differences within than between different places. So to sort of bring this home, here's a couple of pictures. I've picked two not quite random places, but one in the south and one in the north of England, Kensington and Chelsea and Middlesbrough. This is a measure of deprivation, where red is bad, deprived, and blue is good, less deprived. And the key point here, the key takeaway from these pictures is that we have in these two relatively small geographic areas, deprivation and affluence sitting cheek by jowl, right next to each other. The same is true here in Belfast. The same is true in every city across the UK. These spatial differences are hyperlocal. And what that tells us is that if we want to tackle those differences, we will need to act hyperlocally as well. The notion that central government sitting in London, sitting in Whitehall, could have the information, much less the incentives, to tackle these at this scale is totally fanciful, totally fanciful. And that's why the devolution, decentralization agenda is, of course, so important. Last point on the sort of context is, look, it's a couple of years since I've been to Belfast. Every time I come back, the city has grown a new limb, which is fantastic. Belfast is doing well. Manchester's doing well. Leeds is doing well. Newcastle's doing well. Bristol is doing well. Birmingham's doing well. Glasgow's doing well. Cardiff's doing well. Edinburgh's doing well. But let me tell you, they're not doing well enough by international comparison. The UK has a pretty broadly based second city problem. And that's what this picture demonstrates. Generally speaking, the bigger and more populous a place, the higher you'd expect its pay and productivity and all of the things bright and beautiful to be, okay? And generally speaking, internationally, that's what you find. Those are the red dots. When you plot GVA against population size, bigger the population size, bigger the GVA, bigger the income. Except in the UK, those are the blue dots. We appear to buck that trend. Those economies of scale, those economies of scope, what economic geographers sometimes called agglomeration effects, appear not to exist to the same degree in the UK. Too many of our cities, Belfast not on here, but it would be below the line as well, sit below the line. They're doing well in an absolute sense, but they're not remotely doing as well as they could and should by international comparison. There is a huge amount of potential, in other words, that could and should be unlocked here in Belfast and in many other cities across the UK. So let me turn to the question of what it is we should be seeking to level up here. For quite a long time, this word flirted around, sort of untethered to reality. It was kind of a slogan, really. And one of my first tasks when I went in to help out on this was to try and tether the slogan to something substantive. What are we actually seeking to achieve here? And the way we sort of do that, by the way, this is often felt to be the genesis of the expression levelling up, which was Boris Johnson in Westminster back in... Everyone remember Boris Johnson? Yeah. Used to be a host on Have I Good News for You. You might remember that. Him back then, this expression, even the expression is felt to be linked to him. The actual genesis of the word goes back much earlier to a different Johnson, actually, which is Samuel Johnson. Who's heard of Samuel Johnson? Fewer people. So if anyone remembers the Blackadder, the episode on the dictionary. So Samuel Johnson was the one played by Robbie Coltrane in that episode. That's how you'd remember him. And he spoke about levelling up way back in the middle of the 18th century. There's nothing new under the sun, and that's even true of the words levelling up. But the words aren't enough. We need something concrete. And the way we made this concrete in that white paper I've mentioned was to turn this into a set of a mission-based approach to levelling up. Now, this mission-based approach has strong and long historical antecedents. The mission-based approach was probably born in its current incarnation in 1962, when JFK stood up and said, I will put a man, he did say man, by the way, on the moon by the end of the decade. And of course, that one came off. We've seen it, similar sort of approach adopted since. Net zero is a mission-based approach. The Sustainable Development Goals are mission-based approaches. When it comes to applying that approach to levelling up, one important thing to bear in mind, very important thing to bear in mind, is unlike the Apollo mission, unlike net zero, levelling up cannot be defined in a singular way. I would have loved if there were a single way of fully encapsulating all that is needed to level up a place, but there is not. All the evidence here in the UK and internationally suggests it is a multiple recipe. You need a recipe of raw ingredients to make a success of local growth and local flourishing. It's a cake mix, right? And as when baking a cake, the most important ingredient is the one that you're missing, right? For some places, it might be the eggs, for others, the flour, for others, the milk. In some places, they're missing all the core ingredients. And the right recipe is therefore very place-specific. You need to ask yourself, which of the core ingredients are we lacking? And put them into the recipe. And in terms of those raw ingredients, we define them in terms of 12 missions as a way of both telling the story about what levelling up was about, but also by providing an anchor point for action. That's what JFK, the genius of JFK in '62, was providing a time-specific anchor point for action. And we sought to do the same trick here with levelling up, but defined not in a singular way, but in a plural way. That was the 12 missions. I won't go through them all here. The text's far too small to read anyway. The key point, though, is that this does contain all the stuff you'd expect, like living standards and pay and health and infrastructure, physical and digital, and education and skills. Of course, those are crucial raw ingredients, the eggs, the milk, and the flour. But crucially, it also includes some rather more subtle, social, societal things, such as social infrastructure, by which I mean green spaces and decent high streets and football clubs and museums and theatres, the things that make life worthwhile and attract people to place. It includes having pride in place. It includes having agency over your life. These are crucial ingredients in the cake mix too, and all need to be recognised and levelled up if we are to make a success of this project. And of course, these things interlink. What you see is that places that are doing well have this magnetic attraction of businesses and innovation and people and skills and finance and culture. And that builds over time. It's cumulative, it's agglomerative, to use that expression again. Whereas the places doing badly are repelling all of the above: business and culture and people and financing. And the trick here is to flip the magnetic poles for those places repelling people and business and culture and finance, to flip them round so that they are attracting them over time. And a crucial part of that is, of course, people. They are mobile, and we've seen, as this picture demonstrates, historically, something of a brain drain, a migration, in this case, of graduates into the major cities as a motive force for those cities, but one that is not equally shared across those cities. You can go further, actually. I've defined in qualitative terms what levelling up should be seeking to achieve, those 12 missions. But you can go further and put some numbers to how big the prize would be if we were to make good on meeting those missions. And bear in mind here, to my earlier point, there are gains to be had here, both for places that are lagging, if they catch up, but also for places that are forging ahead, but which are suffering on the well-being front. So the gains here are two-sided, genuinely two-sided. It's a twin win. Both the left behind and the steaming ahead places stand to gain to some degree. By how much do they stand to gain? Well, some back-of-the-envelope estimates that I've done, others have done, suggest the win here could be, in money equivalent terms, as much as £100 billion or more each year, every year. And I'd say right now that feels like a prize that's well worth having. It's also a prize that's with us forever. So the long-run cumulative benefits here, the net present value of those benefits, could be as much as a year's national income. A prize, I'm sure you agree, that's well worth having. This is the mission by mission breakdown, but the key takeaway here is that levelling up is a grow the pie strategy. It is not about a slicing of the pie strategy. It will result in lower differences between the slices of the pie, but the key point is that that occurs not through a reslicing, but through an expansion, equivalent to north of £100 billion each year for every year hereafter. That's a pretty whopper prize. So the question now is how to get your hands on that prize. What is to be done to make a success of levelling up? Now here, we are blessed. We are blessed with a richness of experience, both in the UK and beyond, on what works and, just as importantly, what hasn't worked. We know loads about both of those things, what has worked and what has not. Now, if I was summarizing the kind of what works into a few bullet points, these would be among the key policy ingredients of levelling up to success. You should take the first one, longevity. If you have, as we do, deep and entrenched spatial differences, you are kidding yourself if you think those will be closed in 5 minutes. If they are 70 years in the making, guess what? It's going to take many decades of policy action consistently to make any serious inroads into them. We have not lacked, as you all know, in the UK, for regional policy initiatives. They have come thick and fast over the last 70 years, or longer. Again, a chart that's totally unreadable, but the key point is, this is a chronology of regional policies in the UK. The key point is there have been loads of them, and they have come thick and fast. And the implication of that is that none have had sufficient longevity. They have fallen foul of the golden rule of policy success, which is sticking to your knitting on a consistent basis. If this is your map of past policy, this pretty much preordains failure, and failure, of course, is what we have seen. So how to break free of the perils of short-termism? What is this new model of how to do this in a way that the past has singly failed on? Well, fortunately, for those of you that haven't read the 375 pages, the good news is it doesn't matter, because I can summarize them in a single sentence. In essence, what that paper said is that we need a new model of government and a new model of governance if success in levelling up was to be brought about. So what do I mean by both of those? Well, I mean, to make that true over the longer term, to make those new models stick, we probably also need to embed them most usefully in statute, in legislation. And that makes those new models difficult to unpick. Not impossible, but difficult to unpick over time. And that is now being done as well. A levelling up bill is wending its way rather slowly through the two houses of Parliament, which will underpin this new model of government, this new model of governance. It's as much, as I say at the bottom blob, it's less about a bundle of policies. We've had loads of policies. It's as much about a new philosophy for how you go about executing those policies. New model of government, new model of governance. So on the first of those, what am I talking about? Well, I sometimes joke that my period inside the government, the central government machine, taught me one thing above all others, and that was that central government, the Whitehall machine, had a great many similarities with my dog, in that both completely lack any spatial awareness. So when it comes to government, often they don't even know exactly where their pounds are being spent, which parts of the country. And the reason I know this is because they haven't got data on it, so they can't know it. The data don't exist in many cases. So a very simple thing is just knowing, if you're in the Whitehall machine, just where your money is being spent. If you don't know where you're spending it, what hope do you have of levelling up the UK? Once you know what you're doing, you can then make active choices about where those pounds go. If you look at those places where we do have data, what you find historically is that the money has tended to gravitate not towards the poorer places, but towards the richer places. If you look at the way in which R&D monies are allocated, something very relevant, Ian, to here, of course, they've tended to gravitate towards the golden triangle of Oxford, Cambridge, and Milton Keynes. Look at how culture spending has been allocated. That is congregated within the cultural attractions around London. Look at how transport spending is allocated. That too has a big London skew. The same is true of housing and elsewhere. At the very least, if you are to make a success of levelling up, you need to re-tilt that playing field so that money is flowing downhill rather than uphill. Otherwise, government is getting in the way of levelling up rather than making it easier over time. And off the back of the white paper, that, I think, will now happen. When new initiatives come forward from central government, they should be put through the filter, and they will be put through the filter. Is this helping achieve levelling up objectives or not? And if not, why not? The challenge comes before policies are put in place. But even more important than that new model of government is what I called a new model of governance. And the key point here is, to echo my earlier point, it's completely fanciful to think that central government has the answers here. The vast majority of the answers to achieving local growth, surprise, surprise, sit locally. And not just with local government, but with a wider range of local leaders in the private sector, in the university sector, in wider civil society. And this agenda needs to be about enabling and empowering those local leaders, plural, to hatch local plans, to finance local plans, and to execute on those local plans. Part of that is a local government thing, giving more powers to local places to use their information to take local action. That is now wending its way through. Part of that is not just vesting greater powers locally, but also simplifying those local areas' access to financing. Some of the conversations this morning with people here in Belfast have been just how fiendishly complex, borderline Byzantine, the financing rules are. Multiple pots, multiple criteria, takes multiple people to fill out those applications, multiple people to process those applications. Total madness. When I went to government for a bit, one of the first things I did the first week was say, could someone just go and tot up how many local pots of funding there actually are? That took someone 2 days, by the way, which is quite revealing. We stopped counting at 139, each of which has separate criteria. That makes no sense at all. But even more important, I would say, or certainly as important as the government, local government part of this, is the private sector part of this, the business dynamism that is a foundation stone of any, if we are to have any hope of levelling up. Without a dynamic business sector, private sector, generating jobs, generating income, generating skills, you are pushing water uphill, and lots of it within place. So releasing the potential in the private sector is absolutely crucial some examples here, including some very local ones. Had great conversations this morning on just what is cooking on this front. And the short answer is there's some great things cooking on this front, but still the scope to scale them up. The key here is, as Ian mentioned at the very beginning, to move from what are currently a set of fantastic, dynamic, creative clusters that exist across all four corners of the UK, and to grow them, and to combine them, to coalesce them into what in North America would be called genuine superclusters, to connect the dots to a much greater degree. And there are loads of these dots. Here's a map, another map, of just those clusters of fantastic private sector activity. They are many and various. You'll see Northern Ireland, they're in Belfast in particular, being signposted, and in Queen's being name-checked there, and you'll be pleased to hear in the Levelling Up white paper. It's terrific we have this many, but how much better it would be if these current embryonic clusters could be grown and scaled even further to tackle that second city problem I mentioned earlier on, and indeed then combined and connected to create those superclusters that we know are the real wellspring of innovation and jobs and skills elsewhere around the world. And not to forget the third leg of this stool. I mentioned local government, I mentioned local business. Let's not forget civil society, communities within place. If the problems within place are indeed hyperlocal, if they are indeed super granular, if they are indeed community-based, we need action to take place, not at the regional level or even the city level, but a level beneath that, what sometimes goes by the name of double devolution. So empowering and enabling local communities is as important a part of the recipe in making good on the Levelling Up agenda. Let me wrap up so there's time for some conversation about the specifics here in Belfast and Northern Ireland. There are, of course, some big open questions. One that often gets posed is, look, facing this cost of living crisis, which has squeezed everyone's balance sheet, is there any money left for levelling up? My answer to that is there has to be. Because guess what? If you look at the way the cost of living crisis is falling, where the burden is being distributed, it's falling heaviest on those people and those places that were lagging behind. It's made the levelling up challenge even more important. So far from being a reason to stop, the cost of living crisis is a reason we need to speed up when it comes to making good on this. Some steps have been taken towards devolution. My view is that they are currently, at best, half a loaf. Much greater ambition, I think, is needed to fully empower and enable local leaders to make good on their local plans. Ultimately, I think we need a model that is much more localized, what elsewhere I've called a model of community-led capitalism that brings together the combined might of government, private sector, and civil society. Over the arc of history, all the magic has happened. The seed corn of success of the first and the second and the third industrial revolutions came from the combined might, the partnering between public, private, and third sectors. What was true of the first three industrial revolutions of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries will absolutely be true to an even greater degree of the fourth industrial revolution in the 21st century. And Ian, institutions like Queen's need to have a central anchoring role as an anchor institution delivering the fruits of that fourth industrial revolution. Let me stop there and take some more discussions and questions from you all. Thanks everyone for listening.
Brilliant. So it's absolutely lovely to see so many people in the audience today, and a big warm welcome to all of you, and especially members of the Chief Executive Club. I think we've heard a really stimulating discussion, and I had a number of pre-submitted questions that I think have all been answered. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Emma Flynn, and I'm the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Research and Enterprise here at Queen's. I'm also a board member on Cubis, and I'm the academic lead for the Belfast Region City Deal, the innovation projects that are being led from Queen's. I was thanking the public engagement team earlier on for coordinating the I suppose, instability that we currently find ourselves external to the organisation. It's a fantastic opportunity to be able to reflect on what we've heard about levelling up with all the opportunities that potentially we see sitting outside of the walls of Queen's around cost of living, post-pandemic, Brexit. So rather than look at my questions, we have about 10 to 15 minutes of questions. I know Andy is really keen on hearing from you as well. So it's not just about you drawing information from him. He would like to take information from you as an audience. So what I'm going to suggest is, I'm very happy for there to be questions, but if people also have comments that they would just like to make and reflections on what they heard, I think this is an opportunity for Andy to draw in information about Belfast, about Northern Ireland, and to be able to take that away. So I'll take 2 to 3 questions. So I'm going to ask if they're all comments, but I'm going to ask if there is anybody who has anything that they would like to ask. Okay, there's a question there. We'll take that one first. Are there any others? And we'll take 2 or 3 at a time, and a question there.
Andy, one of the things you didn't mention was first past the post versus proportional representation. I'm curious to know why.
Okay, so we'll take that one. And then Owen, I think there's a question over here from Owen.
Hi. Just curious, you mentioned about R&D performance, and we know we've made some strides in Northern Ireland in terms of our growth in R&D, but if you were looking at research and development infrastructure, looking at deep tech companies and trying to grow our startup and future economy, or looking at the long tail of low innovating, low productivity companies we have, which would you prioritize?
Okay, and I'll take a final question if there's a final question, and before we move on to answers. There's one just there. Thank you, Joanne.
I'd just like to know where you're looking geographically beyond Britain at a best practice success in regional policy or levelling up.
Okay, brilliant. So we'll take those 3 questions and then we'll come back to more questions afterwards. So I'll leave it to you to start.
Terrific, thank you. Emma, thank you for those questions. So on the first, I feel in a way I met the wrong person to ask, actually. Given that your question's about politics, and I've spent my whole career trying to avoid politics, indeed avoid politicians, sometimes with mixed success. So, I don't doubt that, it's plainly true that those deep issues of governance are very much relevant, both at the national level and indeed at the local level too. And I think sometimes, the model we have can make for more of a revolving ministerial door than the alternatives. And therein, of course, lies the explanation for the proliferation we see of initiatives and the limited longevity we see of strategies. But the honest answer is I'm not enough of the political scientist or expert to opine definitively, so I defer to others in the audience to give chapter and verse on that. On R&D, and it's a very interesting, very relevant question about if budgets are tight and limited, and you've got a marginal pound to spend, do you spend it seeking to push the frontier of innovation, or to diffuse the fruits of that innovation to a larger number of companies? Of course, the kind of cakeist response is to want to have it and eat it, and to do a bit of both. If I was answering that question from a UK-wide perspective, I would be spending my marginal pound on the diffusion side of things, because generally speaking, UK PLC does pretty well in terms of frontier pushing innovation. Our universities, including, of course, Queen's and Ulster, push very effectively on that front. And the reason we have a big productivity gap is because of that long tail problem you mentioned, that it's not sufficiently diffusing through our regions and through our companies. If we're answering that question from a purely Northern Ireland perspective, however, I'm far less expert than anyone in this room. I think I might be hedging my bets and both broadening the base of frontier pushing institutions, currently often lodged in Queen's and Ulster, at the same time investing in a more effective diffusion engine to get the fruits of that to a wider number of companies. So I fear that's a desperately economist-like on the one hand, on the other hand response. But then again, I am an economist, so expect nothing better. And finally, international examples. I have at various stages looked quite intensively at where we in the UK might be able to beg, borrow and steal ideas from elsewhere around the world and making a success of this. And indeed, I've studied as many examples of failure as of success, which I think is also important to get your head around. So at the strategic level, you know, somewhere like a Singapore has real attractions where they have a overtly strategic approach to industry building. They commit to a 5 or 10-year plan to take the best practice from around the world and seek to build and replicate it end to end, from skills right through to industry, right through to exports, in a way that's proven very successful. Of course, we are not Singapore, including for reasons of politics as well as economics. So if not there, how about somewhere closer to home? Well, one place close to home would be Germany. And they too, it's a different model of, if you like, levelling up strategy, or indeed industrial strategy. And that too, I think, has some considerable attractions in the degree of localization of decision making, in having an explicitly tiered financing structure to ensure that the Mittelstand are serviced with adequate financing in a more collaborative and cooperative relationship between workers through trade unions, businesses, financiers, and local government. I think there's quite a bit we could learn from their experience when we sort of replicate some of the German model here. So we took their Fraunhofer model of innovation, did our own version, that's what the catapults are. I think that was the right recipe. What it wasn't was the right scale, because the UK catapults, and the many in various forms, are about the 10th the size of the German Fraunhofer. And that means they don't push, back to our earlier question, the innovation envelope quite as far or as fast as we might like. And they also, unlike with the Fraunhofer, are not in the diffusion game to anything like the same degree. And that, I think, is a shortfall of the UK system. So a couple of examples there of international places from whom I think we could learn something useful.
So I'm going to see if there are any other questions. While I'm doing it, there's one over there. and there's one just there. So, but just to say, in terms of Singapore, I believe they're also investing in reg tech, and they're seeing the opportunities that there is. And I think for Northern Ireland, there's a huge opportunity around that, around our cybersecurity, the fintech that we've already got here, and the need and the drawdown from company. So I think it's about identifying where that power base can be and where those opportunities are, and then doubling down on those.
Well, I mean, some of the ones you mentioned, I've got a question. All the ones you existing cyber and life sciences and health and digital and creative.
Yeah.
There's huge potential in creative for skill building and job accretion. Reg tech, huge. All of these, on a plausible central view, are going to be massive growth areas. So leaning in now as part of a strategic industrial strategy, I think it'd be crucial. That's right.
Question over there, and then Jocelyn here, and then to you, Sue.
2 questions in this one. Here you go. First one's a very practical one. We looked at the last set of levelling up applications, and in terms of bringing in the private sector to those levelling up applications, there's a state aid question which throws up all sorts of competition issues and challenges around engaging with the private sector in levelling up, and that's a practical thing. I wonder if you have any reflections on that. Second one is more general point, and I have to give my alma mater, Queen's University, after 3 years of graduate work at the Institute of European Studies, some credit for this. But you talked about longevity there, you talked about growing the pie, you talked about new governance and new government. That all sounds very familiar to me, dating back to 1979 in the European Regional Development Fund, and money spent, particularly here, and I think here and indeed south of the border, are 2 very contrasting examples of what levelling up might have looked like and does look like in European terms. We had peace funds here, we had ERDF, we had European social funds, and both in capital terms and in revenue terms, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds since 1979, over the last 40 years. So that for me ticks your longevity box. It certainly gives, and it also, anybody that studied it, and I did, new models of governance and governance. The Northern Ireland Civil Service and government here changed to reflect a much more consultative model around policy development and policy implementation as a result of the European Commission insisting on those processes. Those were a very good thing for democracy here, and very good thing for community engagement and stakeholder engagement in policy development. But arguably, has the economy, has society changed here the way the European Union, the way our politicians, the way everybody probably sitting in this room would have liked it to have? And the answer to that is probably no. If you look south of the border, I think there must be something cultural, there must be something educational, because I was reflecting there, as you said, I talked about Germany and Singapore. The support that the European Union gave to Ireland has made a very considerable difference to society there, the economy there, etc. So you've got 2 amazing case studies on this island, one of which hasn't benefited after massive, massive intervention, far greater, as far as I can see, than levelling up is ever going to do from a UK government perspective. And then south of the border, something which has transformed that economy, at least, maybe not society, but the economy certainly, into one of the best performing economies in the world. And I wonder, in your reflections on levelling up, was it just not fair, or you didn't want to look at Brussels, you didn't want to look because of all of the other issues that you may have dealt with, with the Brexiteers that were coming through the woodwork towards you, I'm sure, in all of this, and we better come up with something clever for, to replace all that good European money. But, I think there's a lot of learning there, and a lot of serious points in what I've just said in relation to, because I'm only really interested in Northern Ireland, I have to say, the impact that we've made here. And I don't see, and I've got pretty clear experiences so far of what's happened on the first and second tranche. Well, the first tranche, which is now some of which is spent, and the second tranche, which is currently being decided upon from levelling up. Sorry, that was long. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I think there was a question just here, and then I think they'll have to be the last questions, but you could come up at the end afterwards, maybe? That was okay. So.
Thank you. You spoke about the remarkable resilience over time of regional differences. And I just would like to mention two books which I wonder if illustrative of this. One is the Upas tree by, I think it was Shetland. The Upas tree, according to legend, he said, was a tree grew in Java, and anything trying to live under its shadow died. And he said the Upas tree in Glasgow from 1875, 1975 was shipbuilding. It was so all-powerful, nothing else could take root. Right. And when it died, there was nothing to take over. Yeah. And the other book was Corelli Barnett's Order to War, when he talks about UK having won the Second World War and therefore UK industry thinking it was good and didn't realise actually how inefficient it was. And it really needed to change to live in the future world. I'm wondering to the extent of which it's cultural mindsets that are the issue here. And are we doing policies around that rather than grappling with the problem of if we can't change people's mindsets about how they approach this themselves, whether the other things are going to be ineffective. We can do structural changes, we can do big projects, etc., but if people's mindsets don't change, they're not prepared to look at things in a different way, that's not going to be effective.
I think that paraphrases into culture eats strategy for breakfast. And then the last question, and I'm mindful that there is one over there as well.
Thank you. It's more of a comment than a question. Thanks very much for your presentation and for your happiness graph. I could feel myself feeling suddenly happier seeing that there today. I'm a school leader. I think education is, I suppose I want to make a comment about the philosophy and the ethos behind the levelling up strategy. And you mentioned social justice. I'm very interested in those furthest from opportunity in the work that I do, and I would work with Professor Greer in his principal engagement sessions, and I know that he's committed to, with Queen's, putting on things like pathways for access, for opportunity, and I know that, like myself, he's very frustrated in how the universities here are funded, which actually pushes a lot of our young talent out of the market here. And there is a brain drain in Northern Ireland. A lot of our young people go and study across the water and maybe settle down there and don't come back. And I would love to see our young talent being harnessed here, but the universities are having to take a lot of international students now to keep their courses in the universities viable. I believe that education is probably the greatest asset for social mobility for any young person. And I think fundamentally, we really need to ask the question, who actually cares about closing the gap? Because the people at the top of the pile are protective of keeping the status quo in place, and with the frustrations certainly here that our own local government won't get round the table to actually govern its people, its communities and the electorate, and dare I say it, serve that community and those people. It's a comment that whilst I totally believe that the levelling up strategy is a good one and is a social justice, a positive move for social justice, who is actually going to deliver this for us?
Okay. Brilliant, thank you very much. So I think to summarise, and I think we need to be quick, I'm afraid, because I think we've run out of time, but the first question was around the issues around state aid, the longevity of funding across North and South initiatives and maybe how they haven't worked and how we can reflect on those. The issue about culture and how that maybe impedes what we would like to do strategically. And I think a really important comment about education and the role of power in education.
Brilliant.
So a lot there.
We'd spend an hour on each of those, couldn't we? But we shouldn't for reasons of lunch. So to the two questions over here first. I mean, state aid. So most of my professional life was spent at the Bank of England. And within that, whether it was bailing out banks or sorting out the economy, the number of times and hours we spent discussing state aid with very expensive lawyers was frightening, as well as being very expensive. Now's not the time for a Brexit discussion, but there are fewer of those state aid conversations now need to be had than need to be had in the past. So why it's not a relevant consideration, there's less of that now than was the case. I'd view that, generally speaking, as being a good thing. you mentioned, lessons from the EU, and there definitely are lessons from the EU. Equally, there are lessons from elsewhere about doing it somewhat differently. If I would, so 2 points. I think there are some real elements of the EU/European model that we would do well as a country to seek to replicate. And one of those was on the sort of financing ecosystem, if you like, where I think across the UK that's ill-equipped to nurture innovation and business in the way that it could and should. Were it me, which is not, I would have what many countries around the world have, which is effectively a state development bank that takes a slug of private money, uses that to crowd in a whole chunk of public money, use that to leverage and crowd in private money, and then allocate in a very purposeful, strategic way to certain projects in certain places. We don't have anything close to that right now. We have a proliferation of initiatives We have British Business Bank, we have British Growth Fund, we have British Patient Capital, and other things besides Infrastructure Bank. I think there's a real strong case for pooling and scaling to give us something that bears closer comparison with either a KfW in Germany or the equivalent of EU structural funds. But the second point is that let's not forget the private sector. The public sector will not, as a matter of arithmetic, and should not, as a matter of principle, be the main financier here. The private sector right now have tremendously deep pockets. We are not lacking money in the world. The question is getting it into the right places. So, it's a deep perversity that Canadian pension funds invest more in the UK than British pension funds, right? That's just really odd. We have between 3 and 6 trillion pounds of assets, the larger part of which are not being put to work in financing British businesses of tomorrow. So this isn't just a question of the taxpayer digging deep. It's also a question of making better use, availing ourselves of monies that do exist. They're our monies, and they're being parked up in very low-yielding government assets rather than being put to work in creating businesses and jobs and skills. That is madness and really should start changing. To your point about culture, absolutely, I think that is true. So, although I am an economist and do spend a lot of my time looking at loads of data and loads of spreadsheets, I made a point when I was at the Bank of England for 32 years of spending at least as much of my time wandering around the country, the whole of the UK, including spending a chunk of time here in Northern Ireland, speaking to businesses and local people, right? And I could spot within 30 minutes those places on the up and those places stuck in the mud. And the difference was culture, right? In the following sense, it's about line of sight. Those places that were on the up, the story they told about themselves was looking forwards and upwards. Even if they had a marvelous past, their story about the present looked upwards optimistically and forwards. Those places stuck in the mud, the stories, the narrative, the culture that they had looked backwards and downwards. Do you remember when we were shipbuilding capital? Of course, this place was. The place I was born in Sunderland was a shipbuilding capital too. The Belfast narrative is changing, has changed. The Sunderland narrative hasn't yet fully changed. Just beginning, I was up there a few months ago, just beginning to change. The story they're starting to tell themselves is about we can be great at this tomorrow, as well as being great about that in the past. So culture, 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 narrative, narrative, narrative. And the more places with that forward-looking, upward-looking narrative, the more we know we're going to make a success of this levelling up thing. Education. I mean, absolutely, I've underemphasized loads of stuff today, but absolutely that is the wellspring of generational success, and therefore the wellspring of levelling up success. Universities as a key anchor institution are a core part of that. And of course, these days, Queen's being a fantastic example of this, aren't just in the skill building business, they're in the business building business and the community building business. And the role of those anchor institutions has never been greater than now. You'd expect someone who spent 32 years in an institution to be institutionalized, and indeed I am. But I also am a sometime student of history, and it's clear that to make a durable success of anywhere on the planet, you'd need that combination of, you need two eyes. And those two eyes are innovation on the one hand and institutions on the other. Without both, you will not succeed. And education institutions have a prominent place within that. So here to all you say about that. I would say, with my RSA hat on, that I think the education institutions, in the broader sense of that word, that have served us actually rather well for the last 2 centuries, will need to change and adapt fundamentally if they are to continue to serve us well in the 21st century. In a world of 100-year lives and 80-year careers, we need to make a reality of lifelong learning, not just use it as a rhetorical device. And as work becomes more like education in the sense of being lifelong, education will need to become more like work in the sense of being team-based and experiential, not individual and examination-based. So a massive agenda there, but one that couldn't be more important to social mobility. And the final question...
I think that was all.
Oh, that was all?
I think that was all of them. No, I think that was all of them, if there was anything else. I'm just mindful of time, and I can see Joanne mildly panicking about lunch. So I just want to say, first of all, I'd like to thank Joanne and the public engagement team that have done all of the organisation behind this. I'd like to thank Ian, who did the introduction, but most of all, I'd like to thank Andy for a really stimulating discussion, presentation, and some really interesting questions from the audience and comments as well. So thank you very much, everybody. If we could all just... So I think some of you are joining us for lunch, which was just there, and for those of you who aren't, then please have safe travels.